Hello? Can you hear me? I cannot hear you.
Hi, Jolynn. Can you hear it now?
I can. Thank you very much.
Deciding my great house to mute the room. Y'all come on in and have a seat, get your coffee. Janet's gonna give an announcement once we're all set. Let's settle.
Okay, let's get that started. So, in chat, 7-Eleven.
We are. And I know, we're seeing some of our guys in there. Yeah. We're gonna make sure. Thank you. You're welcome. I had the same response. All right, y'all. Let's go on and get started. I am so happy to be with you all today. I'm Claire Berry. If you weren't here last week, I'm covering for Guy while he's at Chautauqua. A little bit about me. I'm a child of this church. I'm a Presbyterian minister. I work most of my days with college students at Vanderbilt and Belmont with the UKirk Nashville Presbyterian Campus Ministry, which Westminster, among many churches in our Presbyterian, regularly supports and volunteers with. And so Heidi and Guy just invited me to come and spend time with the church this summer while Donovan's on sabbatical, and most of my students are either working really hard in jobs in town or they're off having adventures in other places. So it's good to be with you all. Zoom seems to be working. This is a more sophisticated setup that I am used to. So if you see me messing something up, just tell me. If you feel like you can't hear, just tell me. Jolynn, I think especially for you, thank you for chiming up when I had us on mute for a minute there. Great. So Janet Kuhn has an announcement to make before we start.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to make a quick plug for the August 4th event in May. We're looking to have folks from Presbyterian Ministry to update us on what's been going on there. But also, it has been 10 years since we started joint learning. Some of you were involved back then, and it started with Presbyterian Ministry children coming here, along with our Westminster kids who are like in high school now. But we're going to start out a completely different, new way of partnering with them through joint learning. And that is that they have mentors that meet weekly with mentees, K through 5. It's all the way through high school, but particularly for this project, K through 5. And what we're going to be doing is helping put together boxes that these mentors can use with their mentees in their one-on-one time. It's especially going to be targeted for the kids who are like 2 grades behind in reading. So we're coming up with these boxes. So if you have a creative streak, it's just a little activity that a mentor can do with a mentee for like 20 minutes. And it's like you can work in STEM or crafts or some kind of creative game and work in literacy. So just as an example, I mocked up one, which is a rise box for STEM, fun with geometry. And when you open it, what you have is the instructions for the mentor, a whiteboard, and then basically they're gonna make geometric shapes out of mini marshmallows and toothpick. So they could be together to create a triangle, which talks about a triangle that we should have on the other side. So you can see the child starting to change the triangle into a square, and then for older kids, you would have these kind of cards where they could build, you know, octahedric, like much more complicated 3D structures. And I'm waiting on a book that The Man Who Invented Geometry. That's just to kind of give you an idea of what each box could contain, but you can imagine that if you were doing a craft, you could do build a bug, and you could have a kindergartner tell a story. You could have a fourth grader write a story. So that's the kind of thing we're doing, really fun, simple little boxes. But if you're not up for doing something like this, and you just want to find out what's going on at TCM, join us on August 4th, Friday at 10 o'clock. It should be less than an hour. Love to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I also just wanted to share with you all, there's several greeting cards in the back. One is for the Williams family who just welcomed a new baby girl. One is for Nancy Ray, who's in the hospital, and one is for Missy Porter, as her father just passed away. I would like to open us with prayer, if that's all right. Gracious and loving God, I thank you. Thank you for this group of your disciples who you've gathered here by your Spirit to this moment. God, I pray that as we read, as we discuss with one another, as we bring our questions and our opinions and our perspectives to the table, that you would be with us as a friend among us. I pray that you would open our hearts and our minds as we digest a lot of information that is very personal at times and raises big emotions for us at times. God, I pray that you would lead us into truth. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Claire, it might just be me, but I'm having a real hard time hearing.
Hearing me? Is it better when I speak into the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do a better job. I'll also speak up. Okay, so this week, holy balls. I wanted to start really just with the very first sentence of this chapter. I think is almost not just a topic sentence for its section or its paragraph, but sort of the whole chapter. In the years after 9/11, more extreme expressions of militant masculinity gained traction across American evangelicalism. So there's two things that are happening in the chapter. One is that there's this rise of something more militant, we might even say more aggressive or more violent. And then also that the marginal views, like views that might have been considered marginal a few years before, the author argues are moving toward the mainstream of evangelicalism. So two movements, one sort of toward aggression and an aggressive masculinity in particular. And the second, that's not just on the fringes of evangelicalism, it's moving more towards being normal. And I think that helped me to bind together all of the disparate people and things and movements and organizations that are in this chapter, which I know I'm not going to be able to keep track of over the long term necessarily, but I it was helpful to group them in this larger cultural trend. At least that's what she's arguing, right? So just to start off, I've divided this chapter into sections with the sort of the big breaks. So the first big break comes on page 188. And so let's just talk about the very first couple of pages here. God, men, revivals. This is on page 187. Just this rhetoric. Brad Stein, Challenging Men to Kick Ass. You can read the rest of it yourself. And then we have this example, something I'd never heard of Christian mixed martial arts. As a kind of organization that was formed. I made a note down at the bottom of 187 about how James Dobson, and if you're having trouble keeping track of all these people, James Dobson is the one who wrote Dare to Discipline about spanking children, focus on family. And his son Ryan was involved in this. So what we're starting to see too is a little bit of a generational quality, fathers passing leadership to their sons. And another quote that I kind of captured was on 188. As militant masculinity took hold across evangelicalism, it helped bind together those on the fringes with those closer to the center, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish the margins from the mainstream. So that's that theme of what's marginal moving towards the center again. Just to start off, I wonder, for me, perhaps for you, it might be easy to disparage what's being described here. I don't know if you feel that way. And I'm trying to open up within myself a place of understanding why this is appealing. So, because I've had this feeling reading this book, I was just sharing with Kay, that reading it is making me feel very reactive. Like I have kind of a knee-jerk moment a lot. There's a paragraph later where I just wrote an exclamation point next to it. And that I think is really interesting. So I'm not even forming a thought or an argument or a question, I'm just having this reaction. And as Christians, I think we have to be a little careful of that, right? Because I think we can end up reproducing the kind of rigidity that we don't like in this way of thinking, which is fascinating way that being a human works. So I'm kind of curious if we could slow down over this. What do you think might appeal to people? What might appeal perhaps to men in particular about this vision? Or if you want to take it on the other side, what might be not appealing about nonviolent Christianity? Why isn't that appealing? Yeah.
I think it takes more patience. I think it takes more thinking. It is easy to react physically. It's not easy to be to work for compromise, to be gentle, to be a pacifist, to hold your temper. I think it's much easier to be aggressive. And
Interesting.
I
Yeah,
feel like the whole patriarchal thing just really feeds their ego.
yeah, so someone who also might have some kind of egoic need, especially in an individualist culture where it seems like you can either be a hero or you can be a loser, and it all kind of comes down to you. You're feeling like a loser, this kind of can build you up. I bring in individualism there because I think it's part of the problem here, is that it's not about me and my community. It's just about me and whether I'm worthwhile or not, whether I'm a real man or not, and that kind of thing.
But isn't there an appeal? A group appeal, just like we see currently in politics? I mean, not you as an individual, but it supports you to see a gang doing what you're doing.
That's an interesting paradox, yeah. I often had that thought with, even last week with the, Promise Keepers. And the way they kept describing it was like a stadium full of people.
Yeah.
And what that kind of means to you, that you say, oh, I must be in the right, I must be part of something. A need to belong, which I think is like a very beautiful need that we can relate to. And then the way that can get yeah, interpreted in somebody's life is not necessarily as beautiful. That's interesting, yeah.
Well, I'm Mark Beveridge. This is the first time I've been here. I recently retired. But so I'm glad to be able to be on this book. I was like, I want to be there. So, and I don't know how much y'all have already said and talked about, so I don't want to, I could really for a long time about this, but I'm sure you already shared most of this. But I do think that it's easier for people, in particular men, in a group sometimes to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do alone if they could reflect and think about it. Just think of what, lynch mobs have done in the past, or posses, or think about the Vanderbilt rapists, where there were 3 or 4 men down there together abusing this woman, when maybe by themselves, something would have said, this is not a good idea. But when others are there sort of acquiescing, and maybe even sort of leading it on, then they're able to do things that you go, how can human beings do this? So there's one thought to the point about the group setting. As far as why is this appealing to men? I mean, I think it has so much to do with, with so many factors, but certainly one of them is that women now are able to do everything that men do. And they've always been able to do that, but we recognize it. And in fact, we're more women are in college, doing better in college. At my former school, I mean, most of the people, they want to accept are women, but they're going, we got to take some men, so it balances out. So men are feeling threatened by that. Throw into the fact that the economy is terrible. People in rural America, they can't make a living, and now they feel really bad. And so it's just a sort of self-defeating thing. I think that, not that she's perfect or didn't have problems of her own, but I think Hillary Clinton touched that nerve. In fact, there was so much anger and disregard for her because, well, here she is, she's a woman. She's a lawyer, oh my gosh. And she's taught at Yale. I mean, she's got the big 3. And so for rural men, it's like the world's worst. It's a disaster. We can't, that's an easy person to hate. So I'll probably talk about things y'all have already said.
No, it's good. It's really good to keep coloring it in, because I think part of what I'm getting at is that we're talking about some pretty black and white thinking and rigid thinking. And then we don't want to respond to that with rigidity. Does that make sense? Okay, yeah, Janet.
I'm wondering too, if it's like, boys will be boys kind of thing, and being frustrated with, I'm talking about like, why you said, why would men be attracted to that?
Yeah.
Me being frustrated with boys with lately, or in more recent times, being told you're wrong. Like, they can't say that, the whole politically correct thing. Like you're being scolded, every time you open your mouth. And to be in a place where they can just, say what they want to say without being ashamed of it. I'm going there.
Yeah.
To where, like, why that might come to them, why that attractive.
Yeah. Yeah, wanting some relief in a way from high stakes. I see this with college students too, who would define themselves, I would say, across the theological and political spectrum, where they're all afraid of saying the wrong thing. They're very afraid of that, and saying it in class in particular. I had read about this phenomenon in the news, where students say, well, I try to figure out what the professor thinks, and then I try to, if I'm going to speak up in that class, I'm going to try to be harmonious with what she thinks. I find this extremely alarming. And it wasn't even the way I thought of my professors in college 15 years ago. I think the funny thing for me too, for some context on me, I was a women's gender and sexuality studies major. So I was hanging out certainly at the left end of what my college was doing. And yet I still didn't feel like I was there to have my professor be my guru. And if I didn't agree with her, oh my goodness, I was a bad person. I feel like there has been a shift, and it's a recent shift. toward, again, it's for this kind of rigidity. And so then it feels like a escape when someone says the quiet part loud, you all heard that expression. So, when someone says something that's politically incorrect, they're seeking some relief. You may disagree with me, by the way.
But just to add that, the catch, like, maybe the current catchphrase would be, he tells it like it is.
He tells it like it is. Yeah. Yeah,
You ask what might not be appealing about the nonviolent perspective.
yeah.
And I think that perhaps a spin there is that, well, if I'm nonviolent, then I'm potentially a victim. If, yeah, I can be hurt, it's more vulnerable. It is by definition more vulnerable.
Yeah.
The idea that there is strength in that is not, is to be nonviolent, you must be strong in your convictions and perhaps strong physically as well to be ready for what happened. Feels contradictory and not obvious.
And that's a great place I'm gonna take us on from. So to be nonviolent is to risk vulnerability, to be vulnerable. And here we are at the cross. You know, what I find really interesting about this idea of warrior Jesus is that, you know, we preach Christ and him crucified. And what a vulnerable position you might argue that our whole religion is founded on someone willingly submitting to violence, which is an odd, weak thing. And I just find it fascinating how that doesn't come up here. They say, well, he had to endure the cross. I'm like, yeah, but he died. Like he didn't survive the cross by being the He-Man. You know, something else happened. So fascinating opening. I just kind of wanted to get us into that kind of fully colored in complex space, because that's where we are. I think another thing too, right? This is after September 11th. And I was a teenager then, but I do remember it well. And I think that the fear that was abroad in the culture cannot be overstated. And I think when you are acting out of fear, you know, that's really where reactivity comes from. And so I see this too as saying, well, we're feeling helpless. How could this thing happen? Some aggressive impulse comes out of there. Certainly with the wars. Yeah.
Often thought that, and I don't know if this relates to this specific part, but we often hear about the unchurched. And it seems to me that these evangelical groups attract a large percentage of people who are unchurched. And therefore, I'm assuming then that they don't have theological or worship grounding foundation in their lives, and they're looking for something. And you know, a big arena, a lot of noise, a lot of, you know, music, whatever it is, especially music that's more part of a popular culture than a traditional mainline church culture, is comfortable for them. And then the black and white nature, they don't have to think a whole lot. They're told what to think, and that's comfortable too.
Yeah. What were you about to say?
I was just sitting there thinking about my feelings that there's people there's always been people who feel like they need to be better than somebody else. And that maybe I have attributed that to men. And this sort of keeps bringing out men being the ones that have that feeling. And is that really true? I mean, am I as a woman, do I ever feel like I need to be better than somebody else? We don't hear this about women. And I don't know.
Oh, thank you for saying that. I think that sort of deep psychological place, I think, is something that we need to think about. Like, we can all get tempted maybe into thinking, well, in order for me to be good, that person has to be bad, or in order for me to be powerful, that person has to be weak. Otherwise, I won't know that I'm powerful. Yeah, and maybe that looks different, for people of different backgrounds, genders, what have you, yeah. I'm gonna move us on just because we have a big chapter here, but let's just keep that coming.
That's kind of a
Yeah,
thing that is, not necessarily that we have to think that we're better than also, but, we're talking a lot about the men here, but most of them are married, there's wives, there's women that are in this movement, that she's not talking about that, and that's the ones I have even more trouble understanding, how they go along with all this.
oh, that's a great point, yeah, like, we're more than halfway through, right, so we're starting to see the perspective of the author in the book, and some things that I don't know if that's gonna get spoken to, I haven't finished the book yet, but yeah, like maybe that's a question we might lead with. I think it's interesting to look, if you do look at the next part about the homeschooling, so this is kind of the next big chunk of information. So I'm curious if you'll just raise your hand, did anybody see the Netflix documentary Shiny Happy People? Okay, if this has made you feel curious or horrified, but let's say curious, no, interested, I don't know. And you have Netflix, that's a good documentary to watch.
Shining, happy.
Shiny Happy People, and what it's about is the 19 kids and counting family, the Duggars, who come up, they're one of our photo illustrations on page 192, that's the Duggars. And they had a television show that sort of documented their lifestyle as part of the Quiverful movement, so the pro-natalist movement. So one thing that I had never been aware of is what a turning point the middle 90s were for homeschooling. So in 1994, you saw this on page 188, there was some legislation that was going to make it much harder to homeschool your kids. Because you would have had to have a certified teacher teaching them, which most parents in homeschool would not be. That was defeated, however, and then new legislation was passed to really protect homeschooling as something you could do essentially in the same way private schools are protected, was my understanding. So it's with us to stay. And homeschooling itself, neutral concept. But what we found in evangelicalism was that you had people like Bill Goddard and his curriculum group, the IBLP, we read about that before, who their curriculum, their ideas are really just being adopted by these homeschooling parents to the point where you have a lot of these ideas of biblical patriarchy that are being taught to children from the time they're very young by their own parents. It's just the way they were raised. And it's really interesting, some of the things that get folded into homeschooling curricula. So I was looking at the bottom of page 189 and talking about Doug Phillips. Doug Phillips is another second generation person here. So we see that he is the son of Howard Phillips, who was kind of a behind the scenes person for the Moral Majority. And he starts publishing, books, various kinds of media, including this book called Robert Louis Dabney, The Prophet Speaks. And this is our first example of a Presbyterian in this chapter. And I do want us to kind of pause over who these people are. Because I think it's really easy to say, oh, these evangelicals, this and that. In many ways, we're kind of drinking from the same well, or at least we have shared history. So who is Robert Louis Dabney? Had anyone heard of Robert Louis Dabney before? Me neither. So he was a Southern Presbyterian scholar, theologian. He lived through the Civil War. He was educated at Union Seminary in Virginia, which is now a PCUSA seminary, but you have to remember we have a divided Southern and Northern church during most of his life. So he is an interesting person to have as a hero, but in his time, he was very, very influential, especially on the conservative end of the Presbyterian Church and on the Southern Presbyterian Church. The things that Doug Phillips focused on with him was that he was a critic of public education and women's equality. He tried to kind of skirt around that he was very much a proponent of slavery. He had been in the Confederate Army, he was a Confederate chaplain. He was also Stonewall Jackson's chief of staff, so a very close personal aide of Jackson. And throughout his life, after the Civil War, after the Confederacy was defeated, he was an advocate really against the increasing rights of Black people. So living in Richmond, he was very upset by Black people who've been newly freed, buying land, moving freely around Virginia. He wrote about how he wanted to immigrate to South America because he just couldn't imagine integrating. So a quote of Dabney's is either the Negro must move or the college and seminary must move. So he felt that all had been lost for white people in the Civil War. So that was very much downplayed in Doug Phillips' work. But what he took from this 19th century thinker who had been prominent in the church was a complementarian or a lesser role for women rather than an egalitarian role. And then also a skepticism about public education. So it's just interesting to see who gets brought in, and these people are a part of our history too, as Presbyterians in the South. You know, I didn't go to Union, but I have friends who did. It's interesting to think about how much these institutions have evolved and changed as well. So Quiverful is on page 191. It's just this idea that you're going to fight a culture war. You need a lot of warriors, so you better have a lot of babies. And then the paragraph that made me write my exclamation point was the one about how on the bottom of page 191, more and more you saw these kids who were raised in these very conservative Christian homeschools, that they became White House interns at a hugely disproportionate rate. Anyway, what were you gonna say?
Oh, I was gonna say, that was what made me like gasp.
Yeah. Help me unpack it.
So in that documentary, they talked about how that was a goal, and something that they were pushing for was to try to raise future government leaders. That was a very intentional part of their training. Their homeschool curriculum was pushing kids towards government roles.
Yeah, the leadership in
In
toward leadership specifically in government, yeah.
Yeah, which
Yeah,
yes.
That part of the movement seems to begin to care less and less about gender. Because there are young women and girls that are engaging very actively in that. And so within their movement, you've got the breeders and you've got the leaders. And it starts to feel very Handmaid's Tale. I was really surprised. And I'll say there's sort of an insidiousness that is surprising to me. First of all, I've been homeschooling my son for a few years, and I get emails regularly from HSDLA. And like my reactionariness to my reactions to this book happen to be around things like, oh my gosh, that totally is part of my life. Like that's part of my background. And I'm like, were my parents white evangelicals? Well, yeah, kind of. So, you know, and so just kind of sort of embracing that. But I think also, somebody was talking about white evangelicals, like pulling in the unchurched. it also really seems like at this point in time, there are lots of people who are very much in agreement with white evangelicals who still have no involvement with the church at all. Lots of people who feel like they're really honoring this country and honoring God, but they have no church involvement whatsoever and very little in their background. But this particular movement sort of, there's an insidiousness to it, which I think all power can tend to move that way. That I think is interesting to be aware of.
Yeah, thanks. Let's kind of hover here for a second. We can keep talking about, this part of the chapter. You know, it's interesting. One of the questions I had written down is again, like, what is our relationship to the concept of homeschooling, or to the concept of having a lot of children? You know, what can you relate to about these practices? Or if you have a strong reaction to them, what do you think is behind that? Cause yeah, I had this thought, I have a 1-year-old, I think as some of you know, and you know, when the Covenant shooting happened earlier this year, I definitely had a thought like, why would I ever send a kid to school? I know everything that a kid, you know, I had this reactive moment of why would I ever risk this crazy world? And so as I was reading this, I thought, what if I believed that there was that level of threat waiting for my child in the public school system, but the threat was ideological, essentially. I don't believe that, but what if I did? You know, because you know, I find this kind of fascinating, so I've been trying to slow down over it. Do folks have other thoughts about this part of the chapter before we talk about Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill?
Oh, gosh.
I found this part just so flexing. Because if you look at why we became a country, it was because we wanted out from tyranny. You know, very much a separation of church and state. And now, you know, fast forward, and as you said, it's been really picking up steam in the 90s. There is such an intertwining of, oh, you know, I'm a Christian and a patriot. And I feel like, you know, for a long time, I felt like, you know, my religion was taken because evangelicals were like, well, we're the true Christians, you know, and now it's almost like you feel like your patriotism has been taken because you're not just wrapping yourself in the flag. And I finally come to a point where the last several years, I'm like, I now tell people, you know, they'll say something, oh, you know, this person did this because they're Christian. And I'll say, well, I'm Christian and I did it the other way. And it's because I'm Christian. Or I'm patriotic and I did it this way because I'm patriotic. I think we've got to, in a nice way, say what our beliefs are. And I've always been very hesitant in a polite way to do that. But I think this evangelical movement has done it so loudly. And it's almost like a frog being boiled. It's just steadily, the temperature just keeps going up and up and up. And we're just all, I mean, it's a mess.
Oh, that's really interesting. I think that something you said that I resonate a lot with is part of what this book is challenging me to do is to positively state what it is that I believe, and I might be wrong. But to try to positively state it, it's so easy to assume a sort of a negative view, which I don't mean as a pessimistic view. I mean, a negative view is, well, I don't believe that, you know, and then to try to say something and to attempt it and to welcome being wrong, but to say something, or to try to sit down and write, what is it I really do believe about gender You know, maybe I don't have to share it with anyone to start with, but just like, you know, just write it down and think about where it comes from, because I do think that they have given a strong, positive message. And a positive message usually has to be met by another strong, positive message rather than just a criticism. In my experience, I don't know, what
I
were you
think
gonna say?
there's definitely truth in that. I completely agree with your statement about it being insidious, but that is the people that see the world, whether it's our country, what it means to be a patriot or our religion, are generally good people, you know. They're good people, well-meaning people, and they think they got it right, you know, and you see it differently, but it's not like they're evil. To my way of thinking, they're confused, they've been manipulated, they've been misled. But, you know, I've always, I mean, I was a history major, I always scratched my head, how did Germany happen? How did, in the 20th century, how did a people adopt a man like Adolf Hitler, let Jews be, their books thrown out?
Yeah.
And how did all this happen? And this, what has happened now, has completely educated, enlightened me about how good people, how this can happen. And it's happening in our country, and it is so bad, to your point, because the two things I love most in the world, the only two things besides my family that are important are my religion and what it means to be a Christian and my relationship with God, and that's being destroyed by who's got the microphone and who's loudest. And then on second thought, my country, which I can see is being destroyed. And it is so frustrating. But to your point, back to your point, to try to make this relevant to what you were saying, the only way back is to somehow not just point the finger and criticize and say, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad, but somehow to recapture and present a message that that people can begin to buy into. It's very difficult and frustrating, particularly in Tennessee, with our leadership here. You know, every day brings a new thing. Every day brings a new thing that you just scratch your head. I mean, I don't think 15, 20 years ago, you would have had people taking books out of public libraries. That sounds like someone in Germany, or it sounds like the Scopes monkey trial. You're going, how do we get here? So how do you push back? Well, it would be nice if leadership, particularly Christian leadership, you know, in the church, number one, would push back. And
But you are hearing. Also, right, legislating, and they are saying that it's not, is there a thing that is that our founding fathers wanted this to be a Christian nation? And the founding fathers in the Constitution supports them, when I, you know, it doesn't. But people say, okay, yeah, this is, we're that we're supposed to be a Christian nation. If those people are wrong, they're wrong. And I see it. Smaller communities and even in larger cities are smaller communities. But when something like catches a hold into a small community and you're part of it, you want to be part of that community, and if it's a small rural area, your lifestyle, you don't want to be, you have to go along with it.
But even if you're a Christian nation, okay, what does that mean? Well, if you're Christian, you're truly Christian, the way I think most of us feel like, then you love everybody.
Right.
And you make room for somebody that doesn't see it the way you are. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being a Christian. We're losing Christians because what it looks like to be a Christian nowadays, particularly to a young person who see the hypocrisy of it and how it is a dead end, to be honest, to be a Christian the way it's being practiced now by the local people. I don't want to be part of that. Why do you think people in Europe are leaving? I just got back from Scotland. You know, they're not, the religion and the loud part of religion now is not something that is going to stick around. You know, they're just going to go away from it.
Yeah, that's a good conversation. Yeah, thinking about the history of the founding of this country before we move on, just a couple of things. So as you all know, many of the founding fathers, who we actually call founding fathers, were not religious people. Some of them were Presbyterians, some were Anglicans. Those are kind of your big groups in the very powerful white people who are part of the revolutionary leadership. And one of the reasons that they encoded a separation between church and state was that you have to remember, they had witnessed themselves, or within a generation or two of witnessing, terrible violence in Europe between Protestants and Catholics. And so their vision of a separation was really about peace. And that was what they could agree on, whether they were deists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, or what have you. So it's in some ways, it's kind of a freedom from religion. It's saying that you will keep that private, and that was the norm. Live in public life according to your values. The other thing that's in our own polity book of confessions, but particularly is really outlined in our book of order, is freedom of conscience. So the Presbyterians, also at the same time, late 18th century in the United States, they're thinking to themselves, you know, as long as we agree about very, very basic principles, you can disagree about anything else, and you can tolerate and forbear what other people believe about most things. And it's why when you join a church in the Presbyterian Church USA, because I'm going to stick to what I know, we really only ask you, do you believe in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? And do you want to be a member of this church? I mean, those are essentially the questions. And so in my own career as a minister, when I've looked through, you know, sometimes the long lists of beliefs that you have to basically ascribe to really be a part of some Christian organizations, that's where I feel my Presbyterian roots actually pretty strongly. Because I go, you know, in the essentials, unity, but for everything else, you know, I might be wrong, so there's more than one right way. And I think that does go back, that's a part of our history that we can try to go back and claim, right? So it all has to do with what you claim and what you emphasize. You know, maybe less on Robert Louis Dabney and more on freedom of conscience. So let's move on to Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill. I was saying to somebody before this, I knew who none of these people are. I think I just grew up sufficiently outside of this culture that I just don't know who these people are. I vaguely heard of Mars Hill, 15 churches in 5 states in the global ministry. I went, I guess this has not been my experience as a mainline gal growing up. But it was interesting to read about this. Sort of sounds like a kind of a wild character. But the thing I just kept underlining is that he's really making it hip. So this extreme expression of militant evangelical masculinity, that's from 193. He's making it cool. And the power of the cool to bring some of these ideas like homophobia, anti-feminism, sexism, some even kind of misogyny, like, well, if you're a woman, I don't even have to listen to you. To bring that stuff into the center in pop culture of the early 21st century is to make it cool, you know? So I was struck by the power of charisma here, to make ideas acceptable. There were several quotes on page 197 and 198 that I kind of just wanted to look at. Actually, particularly 198. No, 196. Sorry, I had it wrong in my notes. On the bottom of 196. Just want to read this. Driscoll thrived on manufacturing a sense of threat posed by outsiders. Prominently identified security guards monitored the sanctuary and flanked Driscoll when he preached, surveying the audience like a private militia ready to pounce. Male volunteers were recruited to help protect the body. A sense of physical threat dovetailed with religious and cultural hazards, unorthodox theology, Islam, sexualized single women, and effeminate men, all put the church and nation at risk. Driscoll incited fear in order to maintain control. Tolerating no passive consumption, he demanded self-sacrificial service and absolute submission to his authority. As in wartime, dissent was quickly snuffed out. By ratcheting up a sense of alarm, Driscoll justified his demands for discipline, control, and unquestioned power. I think it was just sentences like, he incited fear in order to maintain control, or the idea that dissent in a fearful environment is snuffed out, because it's like, no, we don't have time to discuss it. We don't have time for disagreement. We have to act and always be in that acting place rather than a reflecting place. The other quote that stood out to me is on 198, which is where you have this young man, I think, who was interviewed about why he was a Driscoll fan. This is kind of in the middle of the top chunk of text. I formed a lot of my opinions about theology and masculinity in isolation. The ideas were implanted within male-only fellowship meetings, and I listened to hundreds of hours of sermons by myself, rarely discussing them with anyone except other men. And then he kind of talks about that, and he raises something that you all brought up, you know, that it was an invitation to become important, feeling kind of unimportant, or he describes himself as a beta as opposed to an alpha male. So this is just kind of picking up on some of those same themes and developing them, but I'm curious, is anything standing out to you from this part?
Oh, good. He must have had charisma coming out of his ears. Because, I mean, I'm trying to remember, but it seems like the church, Mars Hill, had 15,000 members. I mean, it was huge. And this is so pitiful to read about this man that would listen to his sermons over and over again. I mean, what is it about a human being that they would, that this is what would keep them going?
They're lonely.
Clara, must be.
I paid special attention when this Driscoll guy appeared on the scene, because he was in Seattle, where my daughter lives, and Seattle is always referred to by Presbyterian ministers I know as unchurched. And people don't go to church there. And my daughter, I'm so proud of her. She goes to a little tiny Presbyterian church that on a good day on Easter would have 40 people there. And her family of 5 is there. And I mean, but what it says to me is, what does this man have? Or what is it that people need that they would fall for this? But obviously there are a lot of people who need it. And it's frightening. What is it that could be so powerful?
Well, it gets back to what Mark was saying about why on earth did, you know, the most cultured, educated country on the planet back in the 30s follow Adolf Hitler
Right.
down there.
Well,
The
and to me,
charisma is somehow the right thing at the right time when other circumstances seems so bleak.
well, and I thought too on page somewhere where they referred to the beginning of the National Prayer Breakfast. Those kinds of things seem so harmless at the time, and we didn't question them and we didn't think. But when you look at those, that's not a good thing. It's trying to make us a Christian nation, which we can't be. You just can't be. But the power of it is to me, it's frightening, and obviously it's frightening because he's so powerful.
Yeah, it's similar, not to this, Perez has got a situation like this.
But that,
Christ Perez has got a situation similar to this going on, their minister has been removed for a while because of, yes, partial authoritarian. Yeah, I don't think it's all the sexual misogyny and all that, but, and I don't know that happened back in the spring, so I don't know what's going on.
Did you all say something? I feel like there's a hand over on this side.
Oh, I was just gonna say, because several people have mentioned that Hitler and the scary comparison. There's a book called Ordinary Men. It was published years ago. But I checked the other day because I thought of it while I was reading this, and it is available on Amazon. But it is about the ordinary men in the police force primarily, who just fell in line and did what they were told, and knowing everything they were doing was wrong, but they did it. And it's a tough book to read because it really focuses on when they came back into German society. They came back from, killing people just constantly to they came back home and resumed their lives as if nothing had happened. And the fallout from that, which was huge for those individual people when they came to grips with what they had done. It's a really good book, and it's a really tough book to read.
You read this sentence, it was like an invitation to become important. And that made me flash back to, why am I a member at Westminster? Because I was invited to go to a Bible study with the women's circle. Why have I become a part of congregational care? Because I was invited by Carson to do hospital visitation. The power of the invitation alone. And we talk about this in our congregation envisioning about how important it is to invite people to join, a new person to come, rather than say, we're so glad to have you here. No, invite them. And so that all these groups invite people in, and it's that invitation that is powerful.
That's a great place for us, I think, to move into this final part where I want to talk about New Calvinism.
Yeah.
And kind of how we relate to that, but absolutely. And I think my question that raises for me is, yes, invitation is so powerful. What are we inviting people to? I don't much feel a need to invite someone else to become important. I think a lot of times in my own, so working in campus ministry, I think of myself more as an evangelist than I ever have in my life. Because I'm constantly working with students who'll say, well, I don't know, what's a Presbyterian? And having to find a way just to say, because more than anything, I want them to connect to God. Just to say, well, what? Just come and see, come and hang out. We're gonna be doing this. And that's hard for me, because then if they don't come, I kind of go, I get dragged back into feeling like a college student myself. We're like, I didn't think I was cool, but I'm not a college student, so I don't have to get dragged back, and I think that it's tough. It is vulnerable to say to somebody else, will you do this with me? We're always in it. And I do think there's something about invitation. You just kind of have to cut through that, right? But I think inviting someone to belong, it just comes to mind to me, is like, that's really what I'm trying to do. Invite someone to, you know, yeah, be a part of what's going on. Invite someone to be who they are with these other people who are trying to be who they are, you know, so what is the invitation to? Invitation to use your gifts, you know, like for congregational care, that kind of thing. Cause yeah, I do think people want to be invited. I think we long, that's a deep longing. Let's talk about New Calvinism. And that'll probably take us to the end of the time. So, I had to do some extra research on this. I remember this. I remember there was an article in the Tennessean, I feel like when I was in high school, that talked about a new Calvinist minister, and it was not a PCUSA person. And I don't remember anything else about it, but just like reading about this kind of mid-aughts movement, so post 9/11, to get that brought kind of these disparate people together in a Calvinist revival. And so you see some of their names here. I'm going to read us a little John Piper in just a moment. But let's look on page 199, very bottom. Even as the New Calvinists rejected or de-emphasized many elements of the broader confessional tradition of Calvinism and Reformed theology, including infant baptism, covenantal theology, and a more nuanced understanding of biblical authority over against a simplistic commitment to inerrancy, New Calvinists claim to find in 16th century theologian John Calvin and later Puritan scholars a meatier Christianity that would serve as an antidote to a softer evangelicalism. Suppressing the emotive side of evangelical revivalism, they emphasized the existence of hell and the wrath of God, which required Jesus' substitutionary atonement, his bloody death on the cross to atone for human sins. Theirs was a properly masculine theology, the story of a vengeful Father God taking out his rage on his own son. Strict gender complementarianism was at the heart of this Calvinist resurgence. For leaders of the movement, patriarchal power was at the core of gospel Christianity. In the words of John Piper, God had given Christianity a masculine feel. So we should perk up whenever Calvin comes up, because like, he's our guy. Same goes for John Knox a few pages from now, so we'll talk about both of those passages. So I thought it was a helpful summary in some ways. It's making evangelicalism, I think, in some ways more cerebral. It's borrowing that from Presbyterianism, so kind of developing more of a head faith to go with the kind of warm piety heart faith of evangelicalism. And taking that from John Calvin, also from, she didn't mention him by name for some reason, but Jonathan Edwards is very, very important to them. So it's like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, colonial preacher, American preacher. And that's the main, I don't know, person I didn't see mentioned here, which kind of surprised me. But they emphasize things like some people are going to heaven, they're elected, right? And others are going to hell. So double predestination. That God is wrathful, substitutionary atonement, which, as I'm sure you all know, is not the only way of thinking about what the cross does, but it quickly becomes you can only think about the cross as human beings have been so bad that somebody needed to die, and that person was Jesus, because he was the only one perfect enough. He was the only one, he was God as a human, he had to be a human to die for human sin, and the Father kills the Son. And then the Father's wrath is lifted. That is really only one way to think about all these things. So in older Catholic theology, for instance, there's the idea that, you know, Jesus came and did everything that he did to demonstrate love for all of us, to show what it would mean to really give your life for the sake of your friends. And that's what the cross does. Could it be? That Jesus, had to die in order for God to, trick the devil and win this battle against evil. That is a very ancient way of doing this theology, and that's not this. So this is like, God is so mad he has to kill somebody. Okay. So I still though was not sure I quite understood the difference between like Presbyterianism and the PCUSA and New Calvinism. So I actually found a document, I'm gonna read it to y'all. That is the 12 features of the New Calvinism as described by John Piper himself. So this is from a speech he gave and I found it condensed online. So I'll just read this to you all, and I'm curious, like, listen for what feels like we're having a crossover in our Venn diagram of like, yeah, I believe that. And then listen for the things that maybe stand out to you as having maybe this distinct New Calvinist flavor. 12 features of the New Calvinism, according to John Piper. The New Calvinism, in its allegiance to the inerrancy of the Bible, embraces the biblical truths behind the 5 points of TULIP, while having an aversion to using the acronym or any other systematic packaging, along with a sometimes qualified embrace of limited atonement. The focus is on Calvinistic soteriology, that's how people get saved, but not to the exclusion or the appreciation of the broader scope of Calvin's vision. So I'm gonna pause here for a second. If it's been a while since you heard of TULIP, who doesn't even know what that is? Yes, okay, we're bad Presbyterians. So this used to just be like the way you taught Presbyterianism, and it's this 5-point theological framework. Okay, get ready, the first one is the best. T stands for total depravity. Who's heard of total depravity?
Total human depravity.
Yeah, so
Otherwise known as people are no damn good.
people are no damn good.
That is,
I like to state it this way. So I personally, I do ascribe to the T. I'm gonna qualify it a couple ways. People can't save themselves. That's how I prefer to write my T. Nobody can save themselves. Sin is this thing that we're swimming in and we're stuck in it and we cannot get out of it without help. Yeah. Unconditional election. This is the piece that, God alone can save us, and God chooses who to save, and it's not based on the good things you did. It's just based on God's free choice. Now, he's saying that even in their, we're not to limited atonement yet. But so this is where you have Presbyterians within the PCUSA even who might disagree, where they'd say, well, God doesn't save everybody. You also have many Presbyterians who are effectively universalists who believe that God saves everybody, but God chooses. So we can't save ourselves. God chooses to save people. Limited atonement means that Jesus' death and its atoning power, so making us at one with God, only applies to the elect. Now, this is where even John Piper is saying, some of me and my New Calvinist friends actually, we actually disagree on this stuff. So some of them believe that Jesus died to save the world, and some of them believe that he died to save the elect. That's L, limited atonement. I is one that I think we like, irresistible grace. So this idea that God wants to save you, honey, you're getting saved. That God's grace is just this huge thing that reaches out to the elect, and that God's gonna get you. Irresistible grace.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Who are the elect?
I mean, the elect are the people that God chooses, and we don't really know. But the idea though, it's sort of a circular thought though, right? Because if you have faith, that probably means that God's irresistible grace is working on you. And so that would mean that you're elect. So hooray for our side, the Presbyterians, yes. Yeah.
But we're also totally fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What were you saying, Kate?
We're also totally depraved.
We're totally depraved. We couldn't save ourselves. God's gotta extend us that toe line, right? And then the last one is P. This is good. Doesn't make sense on the face of it, but I'll explain what it means. It's called perseverance of the saints. And I go, yeah, we work hard, we persevere. That's not it. Perseverance of the saints just means that once you've been saved, you cannot lose your salvation. So God in a way is the one who actually sort of perseveres. But that you can't backslide to the point that you're no longer elect and you're no longer saved. Now, I find it fascinating that most of you have never heard of this. I was not taught it here. I learned it in seminary, probably from like the new Calvinist bros in my class. And I felt stupid because I was like, this is really the way that Presbyterianism is summed up. If you take like a comparative denominations course or world religions, and it's why everyone's like, oh, you guys are predestination, because unconditional election is sort of the double predestination, some to heaven, some to hell. Anyway, yeah.
But that's all about the saved component of Christianity. None of that tool did I hear you talk about loving your neighbors.
Exactly. So it is, that's a good point. So this is not like all Calvinism. This is Calvinist soteriology, which is just what salvation is. All right, I got 11 more points to talk about with the new Calvinists.
We gotta go.
But we'll come back to Tulip. You can also Google it, you'll find more about it. All right, the
If
new,
you go shopping on the website, Missional Wear, which is, and you not, oh God, you gotta check it out. I got Chuck Higgins, a sweatshirt that's got John Calvin on it, you know, and basically what would Calvin do? But it has this motif of tulips on it that I didn't understand.
now you got it. T is for.
Yeah, total McGrath.
Okay. You're gonna like some of this stuff. The new Calvinism embraces the sovereignty of God in salvation and in all the affairs of life and history, including evil and suffering. I know, like that. God is really in charge of everything. There is nothing that God is not in charge of. The new Calvinism has a strong complementarian flavor as opposed to egalitarian, with an emphasis on the flourishing of men and women in relationships where men embrace a call to robust, humble, Christ-like servant leadership. We heard that term last week. The new Calvinism leans toward being culture affirming rather than culture denying, while holding fast to some very culturally alien positions, like positions on same-sex practice and abortion. The new Calvinism embraces the essential place of the local church. It is led mainly by pastors, has a vibrant church planting bent, produces widely sung worship music, and exalts the preached word as central to the work of God locally and globally. So just to pause here, right? Like, I associate with Presbyterianism preaching and teaching, right? That's here. A church led mainly by pastors, I think I go, like, we really think of our ruling elders and deacons, if you got them, as being important positions ordained by God, you know, so there's some similarities and differences. The new Calvinism is aggressively mission driven, including missional impact on social evils, evangelistic impact on personal networks, and missionary impact on unreached peoples of the world. The new Calvinism is interdenominational with a strong, some would say oxymoronic, Baptistic element. So this is where it's saying that these aren't necessarily people who agree about baptism. Infant baptism has been practiced by the Presbyterians always. But Baptists, as you know, don't baptize infants. The new Calvinism includes charismatics and non-charismatics. The new Calvinism puts a priority on pietism or piety in the Puritan vein, with an emphasis on the essential role of affections in Christian living, while esteeming the life of the mind and being very productive in it, and embracing the value of serious scholarship. Jonathan Edwards would be invoked as a model of this combination of the affections and the life of the mind more often than John Calvin, whether that's fair to Calvin or not. This is where we see that idea that it's not just your heart faith, you got some head faith going there too. The new Calvinism is vibrantly engaged in publishing books and even more remarkably in the world of the internet, with hundreds of energetic bloggers and social media activists, with Twitter as the increasingly default way of signaling things new and old that should be noticed and read. It's this idea of kind of staying culturally relevant, even as some of the positions are culturally unpopular. The new Calvinism is international in scope, multi-ethnic in expression, culturally diverse. There is no single geographic, racial, cultural governing center. There are no officers, no organization, nor any loose affiliation that would encompass the whole. So it's not a denomination. I would dare say that there are outcroppings of this movement that nobody, including me in this room, John Piper Pike himself, has ever heard of. The new Calvinism is robustly gospel-centered, cross-centered, with dozens of books rolling off the presses, coming at the gospel from every conceivable angle and applying it to all areas of life, with a commitment to seeing the historic doctrine of justification, finding its fruit in sanctification, personally and communally. That's another kind of call out to Calvinism. So this idea that we're justified by grace through faith. And then Calvin wanted to emphasize that over the course of your life, you're still transforming. The Spirit is working in you to make you a more Christ-like person. And that's the process of sanctification that was important to him. So yeah, that was a lot of me reading, I know, and a lot of kind of church talk, but I'm kind of curious as to what stuck out to you or what you heard. Does this help understand what the new Calvinism is?
Did that come out after, Mark Driscoll?
Yeah, so this is from,
Worried about that too much.
this is a bit retrospective. So this is from a 2014 talk that John Piper gave. And he's not saying like, these are the rules to be in our club. He's just describing the movement. So these are descriptive, like this is what he sees. Like I see us using the internet a lot. You know, he's not saying to be new Calvinists, you have to use the internet. So he's looking back on maybe 10 years of this development and saying, this is what I think it is to be a new Calvinist. Yeah, so a little bit later. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting to talk about it being worldwide and interracial and
Happy to.
but yet it's doesn't seem to be that in practice.
Right, and all these leaders are white guys.
White males, and they don't seem to be very accepting of other races or different.
Well, it culturally, yeah, it definitely calls out that they're gonna be basically anti-LGBTQ and it's not working.
Well, and also to say that it's gospel centered. I don't know that I found that either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What you just read describes my sister's PCA church perfectly.
Yeah, it's been instructive for me. So one thing that happens in the work that I do is I sometimes see students who are coming out of other Reformed veins. So whether that's the Dutch Reformed Church in the Midwest or the Reformed Church in America or the PCA. And I think I have really not realized until I had this position, being the East USA campus minister, what exactly the emphases were, like in the more conservative strains of Presbyterianism in America in 2023. So I didn't realize, I knew women could be ministers. I didn't realize how important complementarianism was as part of the like framework, even for lay people. I didn't realize how important double predestination, you know, some elected to heaven, some elected to hell was in the framework that even lay people would be working with. I think most PCUSA people in the pews, I don't want to talk out of turn here, I think are either functionally universalist or they've kind of consigned it all to mystery.
And I think there's some who still think, well, there has to be a way that you can choose not God, and so then maybe you're annihilated. Or some of us, I think, are like, well, you should be punished, but there's diversity. And you're hardly ever gonna hear from the pulpit a minister trying to say, this is what you need to believe about the afterlife. Am I wrong? Okay. But I meet a lot of 20-year-olds who are like, I'm worried about hell. And I go,
Really?
okay. You know, let's talk about that. And I think this book and just my experience of knowing them is kind of helping me understand that where that's coming from. So where emphases are, right? So we might place the emphasis somewhere else. Like it's come up in this conversation. Well, what does it mean to love your neighbor, right? Like we might be putting an emphasis on morality and ethics in a different place, like worrying less about whether you're doing your sex or your gender right, or having sex in the right way, and thinking more about, I don't know, like a social issue like poverty or racism or something like that. So emphasis, you know, is an interesting concept for me with all this, because we have a lot in common, but like, what do you emphasize? And then we have some things that are definitely not in common. Too. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I'm definitely in a universalist camp, but, and I don't understand, how do you know if you were chosen?
Right. Until you feel the heat on your feet, how do you know?
Say that you've been chosen and you have.
Yeah, I mean, if we could just have John Calvin in here.
No.
He had concerns about his own ideas late in his life.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
John Calvin is one of our guys, but our real guy is Jesus, you know? But then it comes down to that, because if you stick too tight with Calvin, eventually, yeah, you're like, this can't be good. But if everybody else is in conversation, kind of like in our polity, then it opens up and it becomes really exciting. Not just him, but everybody talking.
Yeah, everybody talking is theology too, you know, that's why I say, I wish we had him here, he would just like sit right there, and he'd have his little notebook and his funny beard. But like, he's just one of the saints, just like you are.
Yeah.
We could talk to him if he were here, and when we read about his ideas, we can talk to him. And tell him what it's like. I feel the same way about the Apostle Paul, yes, his words are scripture,
Yeah.
but he's also a dude. And like, we could just say, hey, this is what's happened in the last 2000 years. I want to tell you about it. You know, hear me out. This is what's going on in our church, which is not the church in Corinth. It's not the church in Galatia. You know what I mean? And just kind of be his friend. And I think that's really what Christ invites us to when he calls his disciples his friends. We're all friends. So let John Calvin be your friend. You know, let John Knox be your friend. Let's talk about John Knox before we go. What on earth is biblical hatred? Let's go to that page. Did y'all see that? And that was on page 202. We're talking more about Doug Wilson here. But I just, again, if when we hear someone bring up John Calvin or John Knox, like we should perk up and be like, our guys. Wilson endorsed the concept of biblical hatred, a form of militant masculine faithfulness exhibited by one of his heroes of the faith, Scottish minister John Knox. So I looked this up, and the best that I could find, I do need to look a little bit more, was that John Knox had a theology around hatred that was specifically a hatred for idolatry. So he, as a Protestant in Scotland, was not in power. They had Catholic rulers, and he'd endured persecution. And he believed, whether or not you agree with him, that the Catholic religion was just full of idols. That was part of his theology. And so his hatred was for idolatry that he saw, this is maybe not to his credit, personified in the Catholic rulers, in the Catholic Church. But I think it's just kind of, it's interesting. Here's the person who's not in power, kind of resisting his persecutors and saying, you know, this is my righteous hatred, this is my righteous anger. We might still take issue with that idea, but I just wanted to contextualize it a little bit. I need to read more about it. So it's another moment where I felt like a bad Presbyterian for not maybe knowing enough about John Knox. I'm just being real with y'all. Is anyone a John Knox expert? Yeah.
Been to St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. Yeah.
Oh,
I visited his house 2 weeks ago.
would you like to say more about John?
And I had my picture taken with his statue. Oh,
Yeah, it's so fascinating, right? I'll just close on this note. Denominationalism, y'all, you know, when you get ordained, you stand up there and you say you're gonna uphold like Presbyterian stuff. And I think the tribal part of it, saying, well, I'm a Presbyterian and I'm not something else, has always been kind of hard for me. Because I'm just curious about other ways of answering the same questions, and I'm very much in the Jesus is my guru camp. I don't really need one of these guys to be infallible for me. And it's interesting though, because here I am, a Presbyterian minister. And so I've been drawn lately to want to kind of teach Presbyterian fundamentals in part so I can figure out how I relate to them at this point in my life. So with the students this fall, we're going to be reading the kind of dorky book, Presbyterian Questions, Presbyterian Answers by Donald McKim. Anybody? But not so we can get indoctrinated properly, so that we can add to the answers and have a conversation, you know, because I just think I'm not doing that with them. And here they are as members of the Presbyterian ministry, and, you know, anyway. Thank you all so much. I'm glad to stick around. Yeah, go ahead, last word.
Probably 15 years ago or so, and I don't want to speak out of turn for KC, and maybe somebody else can remember, but he made the statement in a Sunday school class that he basically thought denominations were going to be going away. And that necessarily wasn't an awful thing. Does anybody else remember him talking about that? Because there was so much of that going on with gay marriage and stuff, and he just thought eventually a lot of them took that.
Well, something similar. I think that it's interesting too, like I tend to not use the word denomination when I'm with students. I tend to tend toward the word tradition, which I've heard some of you all using, because it's so dynamic. A tradition is something you've been handed, and so you get to handle it now, and then you get to hand it on to somebody else. And it's just, it's more about stream of Christianity, than it is about a division within Christianity. Something about denomination kind of makes it seem divided,
Right.
whereas like a tradition is something we could have a diversity of and all learn from each other. So I don't know what's going to happen to denominations or to traditions, but that tends to be the way I like to think about it. Any other questions, or I can stay online for a few more minutes, but I want to honor y'all's time too. And thank you for having me. This is so fun. I wouldn't have read this probably without this study, and I've benefited a lot and from your comments and your perspectives too, and your questions.
I think that, there is more of an emphasis on community involvement. And that's a perfect entrance for denominations to work together. And I think AC really got Westminster going in that direction, and Donovan is staying right with it. I mean, just look at all we are doing in the community. And I mean, love your neighbor is the thing. So that's what matters to me.
Yeah. Love your neighbor is the thing. I had a professor at Princeton, Stacy Johnson, who said, he's like, I don't know when it became in Christianity that orthodoxy was required and ethics were optional. He's a softy guy, Stacey Johnson is, he's a theologian, I think about that a lot. It's a challenge to me too, right? Like, cause I can get satisfaction out of thinking, oh, good, I finally figured out the right thing to believe, and I can neglect the right thing to do. So that's a wonderful place to end. We're gonna be learning how to love other people our whole lives. Yeah. All right, y'all, I'm gonna tap out of the Zoom and stick around here in the room. Thank you, Jolynn, Carolyn, and Cynthia for joining us that way. It was lovely to know you were here.
Thank you.
Very good.